Let's continue our read aloud of Who Was Frederick Douglass. We continue at Chapter 6, The North Star. The idea of being captured haunted Frederick. By law, he still belonged to the Alds. After making sure that the money from his book sales would go directly to Anna, Frederick left the household in her capable hands and fled to England. There and in Ireland and Scotland, he gave speeches in nearly all the large cities and towns, asking for help ending American slavery. Already famous in America, Frederick became well known in Europe as well. Frederick was amazed to find that in England, blacks were treated the same as whites. Whether on a train or in a restaurant, hotel, or church, he was welcome without concern for his color. No one insulted him or threw him out, as they often did in America. He felt refreshed and for the first time, truly free. It was tempting to move his family overseas, but Frederick felt he must go home. How else could he help the millions still enslaved? Then a group of his English friends did something remarkable. They raised money to buy Frederick's freedom from the Alds, and the Alds agreed. In exchange for 150 British pounds, or about $700, Hugh Ald signed papers freeing Frederick forever. Freedom! Now Frederick could devote himself fully to his life's work of ending slavery. After 21 months abroad, Frederick returned to America with plans of starting his own anti-slavery newspaper. He moved his family to Rochester, New York, where there was a strong abolitionist community. Frederick published the first issue of his paper, The North Star, in 1847, the paper named after the star that guided runaway slaves to freedom. Published accounts of escaped slaves and news about successful free blacks. It printed stories and poems by black writers. It spoke out against the poor treatment of blacks in the North. The North Star made Frederick a true leader of his people. In 1851, he would rename the publication Frederick Douglass's paper. In his newspaper and in his talks, Frederick also spoke up for women's rights. Women could not vote. In most states, they could not own property. The few jobs open to them did not pay well. Women were expected to marry, keep house, and raise children, while their husbands handled outside affairs. In 1848, America's first women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. Frederick attended the event and supported it in the North Star. A mighty team, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were courageous, determined reformers who worked for equal rights for women. They were also active in the abolitionist movement. Anthony and Stanton met and began working together in 1851. In 1869, they formed the National Women's Suffrage Association to focus on women's right to vote. Stanton drafted a voting rights amendment to the Constitution that was first introduced in 1878. Unfortunately, the amendment was not adopted until 1920, by which time both women had died. Frederick's work as an abolitionist did not stop with his newspaper or speeches. His house in Rochester was also a stop or station on the Underground Railroad. This railroad had no tracks or trains. Instead, it was a network of people and houses that helped enslaved people escape from the South. As conductors on this railroad, Frederick and Anna provided food and shelter to runaways before seeing them off on the last leg of their journey to freedom in Canada. Harriet Tubman, the Black Moses. Harriet Tubman was born a slave in Maryland around 1820. As a young woman, she escaped slavery on the Underground Railroad. She then risked her own freedom to return to the South again and again, helping more than 300 people, including members of her family, reach freedom in the North. As the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, Harriet was proud to say, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." Frederick's work on the Underground Railroad brought him unspeakable joy, but helping runaways was risky. He and Anna could be fined up to $1,000 and sent to jail. Frederick and others began to worry that peaceful means were not enough to achieve their goals. One white man who wanted to use force to end slavery was Frederick's friend and fellow abolitionist John Brown. In 1859, Brown asked Frederick to join him in a raid to steal government weapons at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown planned to give the weapons to enslaved people so they could fight against their masters. Brown hoped that a mass rebellion would end slavery once and for all. Frederick was sure the plan would fail. He told Brown he would not be part of it. Brown did secure the weapons from an arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, but about half of his men were killed, and he and some of the others were captured by U.S. soldiers the next day. Officials found letters from Frederick in John's carpetbag. Frederick had nothing to do with the raid. However, he knew no one would believe this. With government officials on his tail, Frederick fled to Canada. From Canada, Frederick left for England, only to return 6 months later when word came that his youngest child, Annie, had died. Deeply saddened, Frederick took the first steamer home, no matter what danger awaited him. Back in America, he found that to a growing number of people, Brown had become a hero. The United States was now focused on the presidential election of 1860. Frederick supported Republican Abraham Lincoln, the only candidate who opposed the spread of slavery. Although Frederick did not agree with everything Lincoln stood for, he threw himself into campaigning for him. Chapter 7: War Between the States. Abraham Lincoln won the election. He took office on March 4, 1861. In the 6 months following the election, fearing Lincoln would end slavery, 11 states in the South seceded or broke away from the United States. Together they formed the Confederate States of America and elected their own president. And on April 12, 1861, Confederate troops attacked a Union garrison at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. To Lincoln, the purpose of the war was to defeat the Confederacy and bring the Southern states back into the Union. To Frederick, it was that and more. It was a battle over slavery. Frederick was determined to ensure that if the Union won, slavery would be abolished forever. From the start, Frederick felt strongly that all enslaved people should be freed and allowed to serve in the Union Army. This would show Americans that blacks were as brave and deserving of liberty as whites, and with freed blacks fighting for the Union, the South would be drained of its workforce. Lincoln, however, was slow to act. To achieve his goals, Frederick gave hundreds of speeches, wrote to the country's leaders, and spoke out in his newspaper, which he had renamed Douglass's Monthly. By 1862, with the war still raging, the Union needed more troops. In September, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It freed all enslaved people in Confederate territory on January 1, 1863. The proclamation also allowed blacks to enlist in the Union Army. It was an amazing milestone. Frederick knew the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't perfect. For one thing, Lincoln didn't really have control over any of the enslaved people in Confederate territory. There were also 1 million slaves in the border states, slave states that had remained in the Union. The proclamation didn't free them, but the Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point in the war and in the fight against slavery. So this is a map of the United States during the Civil War. And you see these northern states, they become the Union states when the South separates or secedes. These darker states are the South, the Confederate states. And then all this white area is just territory. It isn't really settled yet. And then these two states over here are part of the Union. On January 1st, news that the proclamation had officially been signed came into the Boston church, where Frederick waited with 3,000 others. The crowd erupted into shouts of praise, sobs, and tears, and celebrated long into the night. Now Frederick could work to recruit black soldiers. The governor of Massachusetts asked for his help filling the ranks of the 54th Regiment Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, a regiment of all black troops. Frederick wrote a powerful article titled "Men of Color to Arms," to rally blacks to fight for freedom. "This is your hour and mine," he wrote. "The iron gate of our prison stands half open." He traveled through the North signing up black troops. Frederick's sons, Louis and Charles, were among the first to enlist. In all, nearly 200,000 blacks would fight bravely for the Union and help win many battles. But Frederick was troubled when he found that black soldiers were not treated the same as whites. Black soldiers received about half the pay of white soldiers. They got little training, were not commissioned as officers, and were not rewarded for bravery. Frederick used his pen and his words, writing letters and speaking out for equal treatment. Then he went to Washington, D.C. to request a meeting with President Lincoln. Here was a former slave, one who had openly disagreed with the president, hoping to meet with the most powerful man in the nation. How would he be received? Would he be received at all? At the White House, President Lincoln welcomed Frederick as an equal. He listened carefully to his concerns and agreed that black soldiers had proved themselves in battle. Frederick didn't get all the answers he hoped for that day, but he was encouraged by Lincoln's attention and felt the president was a good man. By the end of the war, black soldiers got equal pay and were allowed to become officers. Some received medals for bravery. Later in the war, President Lincoln invited Frederick back to Washington. He asked for his help designing a plan to evacuate slaves from the South if the Union did not win the war. Respect between the two men grew. President Lincoln was reelected in 1864 after Lincoln's second inauguration in March 1865. Frederick went to the reception at the White House to congratulate him. No black American had ever done this, and police tried to keep Frederick out. But when Lincoln saw him, he said boldly, "Here comes my friend Douglass." Lincoln wanted to know what Frederick thought of the speech he'd given that day. "There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours," Lincoln said. 5 weeks later, the Civil War ended with the South surrendering. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, adopted later that year, abolished slavery forever. What had seemed impossible to young Frederick was now reality. 4 million black people were free. Frederick felt exceeding joy over these stupendous achievements, especially the abolition of slavery, which had been the deepest desire and the great labor of my life. Lincoln now faced the difficult task of reuniting the country. He wanted to bind up the nation's wounds and welcome back the southern states, but this job would be left to others. 5 days after the Confederate surrender, President Lincoln was shot and killed by a pro-slavery actor named John Wilkes Booth. Frederick shared the nation's shock and sorrow at the loss of their great president, a man he called so amiable, so kind, humane, and honest. That one is at a loss to know how he could have an enemy on earth. And although Frederick was overjoyed by the abolition of slavery, he also felt lost. With slavery gone, my voice was no longer needed, Frederick wrote. Where should I go, and what should I do? And this is John Wilkes Booth, the man that shot Abraham Lincoln. So next time we'll go on with Chapter 8.